This is a brutal story. It's going to be painful to hear. It's the kind of story that shouldn't have happened, but it happened all the time. The kind of story that makes you wonder how people lived through it and how others looked away. The kind of story you think can't be real until you realize it happened over and over and over again. And that's the issue. The brutality and injustice that was inflicted on Black people was so commonplace, so mundane and routine, that it was carried out with ease. It was shocking, but also normal. Horrific, but not unusual at the same time. And the story of the Black man I'm going to tell you about reflects this. It reflects how Black people lived and died. Always in injustice. Always a breath away from being the next Black person lynched. The next Black person brutalized. The next Black person who suffered simply because they were Black. This story is just one of thousands. Robert Hall was born in 1911 to Will and Lula Hall in Baker County, Georgia. He was the oldest of their 7 children. Robert married Annie Pearl, and in 1938, they had a son. They named him Will, after Robert's father. Robert was hardworking, but so was his whole family. The Halls had lived in Baker all of their lives. They had been there for generations, and had managed to do something that not a lot of Black people did during those times. They managed to acquire land, and not just a few acres, a lot of land. Will Hall owned a 600-acre farm. This is something that most whites in the area did not have. That made him prosperous and wealthy and respected by some, but hated by many because Black success was dangerous. It was an affront to the racial order of the day. Black people were not supposed to be economically mobile. The system was designed to keep them economically crippled. Will Hall's success broke the racial rules. So as you listen to this story, keep in mind the legacy of the Halls, the pride they carried, the land they owned, and with the deep burning resentment that came from a system that couldn't stand to see a Black family rise above where Jim Crow had designed for them to be, at the bottom rail of society. After this point, this is where the pride begins to fall. This is where the legacy gets torn. And what takes place is brutality, injustice. This is where the story turns horrific. And I want to warn you of that up front, because what they did to Robert Hall is something no one should ever forget. It wasn't just about a man. It was about putting Black dignity back in its place. It was about sending a message to every Black person watching. Don't you rise too high. Don't you stand too proud. The violence in this case was not random. It was deliberate. And all of it started because Robert Hall dared to stand up for himself. He dared to demand what every citizen is supposed to have: justice, protection, and the right to be heard. And for that, they made him pay. In 1942, 31-year-old Robert ran afoul of Baker County Sheriff M. Claude Screws. His crime wasn't great. In fact, he committed no crime at all, except for being Black and alive. Robert worked as a mechanic in Newton, and sometimes he would work on cars at night. This was dangerous, and he worried for his safety. So he would sometimes take with him his pearl-handled .44 caliber weapon. Robert having a weapon was not liked by Sheriff Screws. He didn't think that the Second Amendment right to bear arms applied to Robert or Black people. He didn't think Robert had a right to defend himself. He sent one of his deputies, Frank Jones, to confiscate Robert's weapon. One day in late December of 1942, Robert was working on a car, and up walked Deputy Frank Jones. He went straight into Robert's car, found the weapon, and took it. Robert turned to the one person he thought could straighten this out: his father, Will. Remember, Will Hall owned a lot of land and had some respect amongst a few whites. Robert was hoping his father's status could help get the weapon back. The next morning, Will was eating breakfast when Robert came rushing into his home, saying that Frank Jones took his weapon. Robert told his father he had done nothing wrong. He asked his father if he would talk to Sheriff Screws about getting the weapon back. His father said that he would. Will Hall knew Claude Screws since the two were small boys. He went to talk to Screws and told him that Robert would never harm anyone with it. Sheriff Screws told him to come back in a few days and talk to him once more about it, and that's what Will did. He went back 4 days later to talk to Screws again. Screws told him that if a judge told him to give it back, then he would. Will never talked to Sheriff Screws about this anymore. Robert hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't violated any laws. He hadn't committed any crime by having a weapon to protect himself. White people had weapons in Baker County, and Robert felt that there was no reason he couldn't have his too. So Robert brought a legal action to get it back. And a grand jury actually agreed to hear Robert's case. But remember, this wasn't a regular court proceeding. This was a Jim Crow court, where fairness was a fiction, and the jurors were anything but impartial. Robert stood before them and explained what had happened, that his weapon was taken unlawfully, that it violated his rights under the Constitution. Sheriff Screws was called to appear before the grand jury. Sheriff Screws reminded the jurors what was really at stake here: power, control, and white rule. Sheriff Screws said that if any Negro tried to carry a weapon, he would take it from them, period. And he refused to let Robert have his and would not return it. And that was that. The jury heard what it needed. It sided with the sheriff, and Robert did not get his weapon back. Robert exercised a right that any citizen should. He did what you're supposed to do when you believe the government has violated your rights. He stood up. He spoke out. He followed the law. But we have to remember, those rights were never meant for him. The right to challenge the government, the right to seek justice, the right to demand protection under the Constitution, those rights didn't belong to black people. Black people were outside the law. And if you're outside the law, you can't use the law. You can't lean on it. You can't turn to it. The law doesn't exist for you. Sheriff Screws was the law. He decided what was right and wrong. He decided who had rights and who didn't. He could do what he wanted, when he wanted, and how he wanted to a black person. And because Robert was black, the Constitution didn't apply to him. The rights that protected white citizens, that safeguarded their property, their liberty, and their dignity, was not for Robert. Not for him. Not for any black person. That was the reality for black people. A life of law and lawlessness. The law existed, but it existed in a lawless form. Not to protect you, but to be weaponized against you. All because you were black. And when you look at the history of this country, you'll see that the way Sheriff Screws saw black people, it wasn't new. He was just continuing a policy that had existed since slavery. In the South, black people were forbidden by law to bear arms. In South Carolina, enslaved people weren't allowed to carry or even make a weapon, unless a white person was present. State militias had the power to search black homes, looking for weapons and ammunition or anything they saw as a threat. And in Georgia, the same state where Robert lived, there was once a law that said that black people couldn't carry a weapon at all. But in Georgia, the white men weren't just allowed to have one, the law required them to. So when Sheriff Screws stood before the grand jury and said what he said, he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for a system that had always tried to keep black people unarmed, unprotected, and afraid. After being denied by the grand jury, Robert still wasn't done. He was determined to fight back against the injustice. It wasn't right, and he wasn't going to just let it go. So he hired a lawyer named Robert Culpepper and had him write to Sheriff Screws, demanding the return of what was taken. But that letter, that was the last straw for Sheriff Screws. That letter would spell the end of Robert Hall. The same day Screws received it, out of nowhere an arrest warrant suddenly appeared, charging Robert with stealing tires. And can you guess who wrote the warrant? Sheriff Screws. It was all made up. The charges were false. The warrant was fake. But it was all that Screws needed. With the new warrant in hand, Sheriff Screws put his plan in motion. This was how he would deal with Robert, once and for all. He gathered his deputies, Frank Jones and Jim Bob Kelly, and told them exactly what they were going to do. He said they were going to get that black SOB, and they were going to take his life. Sheriff Screws told them that Robert had lived too long and it was time to deal with him. So the three men went to a local bar. They drank whiskey, and they rehearsed what they were about to do. They rehearsed the brutality, rehearsed the savagery. They rehearsed Robert Hall's lynching like it was nothing more than routine, like it was harmless, because to them it was. Taking the life of a black person didn't cause alarm. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts, no cold feet. They weren't ashamed. They relished it, because to them, what they were about to do to Robert meant nothing at all. And Robert, he meant less than nothing to them. Around midnight, the three men left the bar and headed to Robert's home. But before they left, they told the people in the bar exactly what they were about to do. They said they were going to get a black man who had gotten too smart, They talked about the weapon. They told them about the grand jury. They talked about the lawyer's letter. Do you think anyone stopped them? No. If anything, they probably cheered them on. One less smart, uppity black man to deal with. One less black person standing up for himself. On the night of January 29th, 1943, while Sheriff Screws and his deputies were planning a Jim Crow horror show, Robert and his wife Annie were ending their evening after a long day's work, hoping for rest, hoping for a peaceful night, not knowing what was coming for them. At around 12 a.m., Robert and Annie were asleep when they heard someone at the door. It was Officer Frank Jones. He told Robert to get up and get dressed. He said he had a warrant for his arrest for stealing tires from a truck owned by two white men named George and John Durham. Robert told him that he had not stolen anything. Frank Jones told Robert to shut up and put his clothes on. Robert knew he hadn't stolen any tires, but he also knew he couldn't say no to Officer Jones. Saying no would only make things worse. So he did as he was told. He got dressed. As Robert was putting on his clothes, Jones made a comment, something about that letter that Robert's lawyer had sent to Sheriff Screws. He was making it clear why they were really there. The warrant was never about a crime. It was just a pretext to get Robert out of the house. Once Robert was dressed, he was handcuffed. As they were leaving, Officer Jones noticed Robert's long weapon and took that too, just like he had taken the .45. That was the last time that Annie would ever see her husband alive. And from here, things took a ghastly and brutal turn, one that shocks the conscience. Robert was driven to the Baker County Courthouse. Can you imagine what that ride was like? 3 drunk white men, with one mission in mind, one goal, to take Robert's life. We don't know what was said in that car, but we can imagine what Robert must have felt. He had to be terrified. I'm sure questions raced through his mind. What's about to happen? Am I going to make it out of this alive? I hope my wife knows I love her. I don't want to die. A lot of thoughts too painful to fully imagine. And remember, this was a ride that a lot of black people took, and few ever made it back alive. Robert lived in the Jim Crow South. He likely had heard of lynchings, and he had maybe even known people who were lynched. So he knew what this ride could mean: pain, brutality, and possibly death. When they got to the courthouse, Robert wouldn't get out of the car voluntarily. The 3 men had to work together to drag him out. And once they had him, Sheriff Screws didn't wait. He could hardly contain himself. He immediately attacked Robert. The 3 men began to beat him. They punched him, kicked him, and beat him with a blackjack, viciously and mercilessly. And Robert's hands were still cuffed behind his back as they were beating him. As they beat him, they cursed at him, screamed at him. Sheriff Screws yelled, "Hit him again, hit him again." Robert didn't stand a chance. The beating was so loud and so violent that neighbors nearby were awakened from their sleep. It went on for 30 minutes until Robert lost consciousness. And then the neighbors heard a loud popping sound, a weapon being fired. After that, the men dragged his body across the courthouse lawn and dragged it to the jail and threw Robert onto the jailhouse floor like he was nothing. Around 2:30 a.m., just 2 hours after Robert was taken from his home, Manly Poteet and Henry Neal, attendants at the Poteet Funeral Home, received a call. It was from someone from the Putney Memorial Hospital. They were told to go to the jail in Newton and pick up a black man who had been beaten. The man they were talking about was Robert Hall. When they arrived at the jail, they were met by Officer Frank Jones. He opened the door and told them to take Robert to the hospital in New Albany. Then he asked the men if they were undertakers. When they said yes, he laughed and said that he had a body for them. When they looked inside the cell, they saw Robert, stripped of his clothing, badly beaten and battered and bruised. He was covered in blood and dirt. The back of his skull was soft from being beaten. There was so much blood in the cell that the men slipped as they tried to lift him. Robert was unconscious and practically lifeless. They drove him to the hospital in New Albany. When they arrived, Dr. J.M. Barnett attended to him, but there was no hope. Robert had a fractured skull, 21 contusions and abrasions, deep cuts on his wrist from being dragged while being handcuffed, and his skull was soft from the repeated blows. He arrived at the hospital around 3:30 a.m., and he died just minutes later. Robert had been taken from his home at midnight, and within 3 hours, he was gone. He died a horrific death, one that only Jim Crow could carry out, one filled with cruelty, brutality, hatred, and racism. Do you remember how this whole thing started? We just heard about an act of extreme brutality, but I don't want you to forget about what got it all going, why this happened. If you've watched my videos, you've heard me talk about black men and women who were lynched for allegedly attacking white women, for allegedly poisoning white women, for defending themselves and their families against violence. But this was not Robert's story. Robert wasn't lynched for anything like that. Robert was lynched because he stood up. He literally stood up in front of a grand jury and demanded his property back. That was all he did. And that demand became his death sentence. Struck down for speaking up, for daring to demand what was his. A simple act met with extreme brutality. We've heard about what happened to Robert, but what about the ones he left behind? The ones who loved him, who watched him leave that night, never knowing it was the last time they would ever see him alive. Will and Annie Hall had their own part in this tragedy, their own grief, their own pain, and we need to talk about that. Will Hall saw his son Robert on the morning of Friday, January 29, 1943, as Robert left for work to head to his job as a mechanic in Newton. Little did he know, it would be the last time he ever saw his son alive. Around midnight, Will heard a car pull up outside Robert and Annie's home. Robert lived just 100 yards away, but Will didn't hear any yelling, any commotion, nothing that raised concern for him, so he didn't think much of it. Not until Annie came running. She burst into his home and told him that Frank Jones and Sheriff Screws had just taken Robert on a trumped-up charge of stealing tires. Saturday morning, Will and Annie went to the jail to find out if they could get Robert out. They were told by Edgar Bailey that Robert was at the hospital. Before heading there, Will walked around town, hoping someone might tell him what happened. But what he saw spoke louder than any words could. He saw a puddle of blood in the square, right in front of the courthouse. He saw one of Robert's shoes, torn pieces of his clothes, and then he noticed drag marks in the grass. He followed them until he saw a stream of blood leading from the courthouse to the jail. Annie saw it too. She saw the pool of blood, the torn clothing, her husband's shoe, and you have to believe that some part of them knew. They knew this might be the end, that they might never see Robert alive again. There was just too much evidence, too much blood, too many signs of pain and brutality. They went to the hospital in New Albany, but Robert wasn't there. And that's when they heard the news that was worse than all of the rest. Robert was dead, and his body had been taken to the funeral home. Take a moment. Really let that sit in. Here was a father who had raised his son, and a wife who had loved and cherished Robert. Both of them shattered. Both of their worlds torn apart. They went to the funeral home and they saw Robert, beaten, battered, lifeless. Robert Hall had died a horrific death. Will and Annie got there around 9 a.m. They didn't leave until around 1 p.m. We will never know what Will and Annie said during those 4 hours at the funeral home. We'll never know what they did. Maybe they sat in silence. Maybe they cried. Maybe they screamed. Maybe they raged. Maybe they just wept in sorrow. We don't know. But what we do know is what they saw. There's an image of Robert's body at the funeral home. We've been using a standing image of Robert in this video because we don't have an original photo of him while he was alive. But we do have an image of what he looked like in death. And it's awful. What they did to this black man was awful. I can't show the image here, but you should see it. You should see what they did to Will's son, to Annie's husband. You will have your own thoughts, your own feelings, and your own emotions when you look at Robert, just like Will and Annie did, only they were experiencing it in real time. I've included the image on my blog for those of you who have the strength to bear looking at it. Will also wanted to know something. He already knew the truth, but he needed confirmation. Confirmation that his boy hadn't done anything wrong. So that same day, Will went to George and John Durham, the two white men named in the arrest warrant. He asked them if they had lost any tires, if anything had been stolen, if they had signed a warrant for Robert's arrest. They told him no, nothing was missing, and they hadn't signed anything. After Robert's death, black people were outraged. Everyone in the small town of 300 people knew what had happened. Many had heard it. Some had even witnessed this horror. The local NAACP branch at Albany sprang into action. They gathered evidence and took witness statements and collected photos of Robert's body, then sent everything to the national office. Once it was assembled, it was sent to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. The NAACP was urging federal prosecutors to bring charges for what had happened to Robert. The U.S. Attorney in Georgia, T. Hoyt Davis, also brought Robert's case to the attention of the Justice Department. He saw what had happened and requested that the FBI begin to investigate. Sheriff Screws was no stranger to the NAACP. His brutality and disdain for black people had been reported to the organization long before they heard of what he did to Robert Hall. In 1938, a letter was sent to Thurgood Marshall detailing Screws' abuse on a black couple named the Ashleys. Oscar and Alice Ashley were traveling through Baker County. They were from Florida. Well, apparently, Sheriff Screws and his band of Jim Crow officers didn't like them being in Baker County. They stopped the Ashleys, took them out to the woods where they were stripped of their clothing. They then beat the couple severely and then banished them from the county, told them never to come back again. After Robert's death, Sheriff Screws lay low. When asked about what happened a month later, Sheriff Screws said that Robert came at him with a weapon and that he had to defend himself. He claimed that when they told Robert to get out of the car, Robert grabbed the same long weapon they had taken from his home. Screws said Robert was cursing at them and threatening them and that they had to beat him to protect themselves. They admitted that they struck Robert with fists and said one of the deputies even hit Robert with a blackjack. But in the sheriff's words, what they did was perfectly legal. It was justifiable. The Baker County prosecutor stood right behind Sheriff Screws. He took no action, no charges. In fact, he let Sheriff Screws handle the investigation into Robert's death himself. It's like asking the fox to investigate what happened to the hens in the hen house. It was a joke, but the joke wasn't on Jim Crow. The joke was on Robert Hall and his family. That Jim Crow would never lose, and that black people could never win. After 4 months of silence from local officials, the federal government stepped in. In April of 1943, Robert's case was brought before a federal grand jury in Macon, Georgia. The grand jury returned a 3-count indictment against Sheriff Claude Screws, Frank Jones, and Jim Bob Kelly. The Justice Department charged all 3 men under Section 52, a Reconstruction-era statute that made it a federal crime for any public official to intentionally violate a person's constitutional rights. Before we move on to what happened to Sheriff Screws, I need to tell you about Section 52. This point is too important to gloss over, so I'm going to take off my historian hat and step into my lawyer and law professor mode for just 1 second. The U.S. Justice Department was created in 1870, and one of its first missions was to help the federal government to go after the Klan, who was terrorizing black people across the South. Amos Ackerman, the first Attorney General of the newly created department, made it clear that he would use criminal statutes passed after the Civil War to go after the Klan. Those laws were Section 51 and 52 of the Enforcement Act of 1870. Section 51 made it a crime to conspire to deprive someone of their federal rights. Section 52 made it a crime for anyone acting under color of law, like a police officer or a public official, to violate a citizen's rights. The Justice Department used these laws to try to dismantle the Klan. In 1871, in South Carolina, they used Section 52 to prosecute Klan members who attacked black communities in 9 counties. Over 1,200 Klan members were charged, and all of them were convicted. The government also used Section 52 successfully in Mississippi between 1872 and 1875. But after that, the federal government stepped back. The Justice Department abandoned black people, and Section 51 and 52 were left unused for nearly half a century. Now, there's more to why the federal government stopped using these laws. I'd have to hold a whole law school class in this video to explain why the federal government stopped protecting black people. I'd have to walk you through the post-Reconstruction era and how the Supreme Court, step by step, abandoned black people in a series of cases in the late 1800s. There were laws on the books that could have stopped lynchings, that could have punished the violence, that could have protected us, but the Supreme Court said no, and their decisions left black people in the South at the mercy of racial violence. If you're interested in learning more about that, leave me a comment down below, and perhaps I'll make a video about that sometime in the future. After being indicted, the men pleaded not guilty. The trial began in October of 1943. Judge Bascom Deaver presided. U.S. Attorney T. Hoyt Davis prosecuted the case for the government. Screws and the others were represented by attorneys Bob Short and Clint Hager. The jury was all white. U.S. Attorney Davis put witnesses on the stand to prove that Screws and the others were lying, and that this wasn't self-defense, that this was a brutal beating, pure and simple. A white couple, Mr. and Mrs. Ledbetter, testified. Their home had a view of the courthouse. They said they saw the man beating Robert until he fell to the ground, and then they kept beating him. They watched as the man dragged Robert's bloody body across the courthouse lawn into the jail. Another man, E.M. Mills, he also testified. His home overlooked the courthouse too. He said he was awakened by someone yelling, "Hit him again." When he looked outside, he saw Officers Jones and Kelly beating and dragging Robert. A white woman named Mamie White, she testified and said that Sheriff Screws personally told her he was going to take Robert's life because, in his words, Robert had lived 2 hours too long. Witness after witness came forward. Some who had heard of the man plotting to take Robert's life. Others who had seen the brutal beating with their own eyes. The evidence against these three men was tremendous. Robert's family testified. His father, Will, and his wife, Annie, both told the jury what happened that night. They were forced to relive that painful night, but they did it. They stood in their courtroom and recounted every detail of the truth that Robert could no longer tell, the truth of what was done to their son, to her husband. It took strength to sit in that courtroom, to face the men who took Robert's life, but they did it. They did it for him. They were his voice. They carried his story when he could no longer tell it for himself. FBI agent Marcus Calhoun also testified at the trial. He told the jury that he interviewed Sheriff Screws. Screws called Robert a bigoted Negro and claimed that he had resisted arrest. Agent Calhoun said that Screws admitted that he had known Robert all of his life, but that in the last few years, he said, Robert had become a troublemaker, a leader among black people in the county who were calling for change and racial justice. And Sheriff Screws did not like this. One witness gave a piece of the horror that hadn't been known. Olivia Edwards, who was visiting someone at the jail that night that Robert was beaten, said that she heard Screws when he and the others brought Robert into the jail. She said the Screws could be heard saying, "We dragged him 4 miles already. We can at least drag him into the jail." But Sheriff Screws wasn't going to sit back and stay silent. He didn't care that his brutality had been seen by many. Didn't care that the evidence against him was overwhelming. He still wanted to tell his story. So he took the stand and testified. He told the jury that Robert came at him with a weapon, that he and the others used force in self-defense. When U.S. Attorney Davis cross-examined him and asked whether he hated Robert, Screws said that he had no ill feelings towards Robert at all. He also denied ever saying that Robert had lived too long. After hearing all of the evidence, the all-white jury returned their verdict. They listened to every witness, saw the photos, heard the lies, and they convicted Sheriff Screws, Frank Jones, and Jim Bob Kelly of violating Robert Hall's civil rights. I'm sure the three men didn't see that coming. They were sentenced to 3 years in prison and a $1,000 fine. But this wasn't the end of the fight to hold them accountable. After being convicted, Sheriff Screws was released on a $7,500 bond while he and the others appealed their convictions. Screws was the only one who could afford it, and the other two men remained in jail. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals denied their appeal and upheld the convictions, but that didn't stop them. Screws and the others took their case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court actually agreed to hear it. On appeal, Sheriff Screws and the two deputies argued to the Supreme Court that they couldn't be guilty of the crime they were charged with because when they beat Robert Hall to death, they weren't acting in their official capacity as law enforcement officers. Remember, the federal statute that they were charged with, Section 52 of the Enforcement Act of 1870, pertains specifically to public officials who violated citizens' rights. Essentially, what Screws and the others were saying is that during the beating, they weren't the sheriff and two deputies. They were just Claude, Frank, and Jim. Three men who just happened to be beating Robert Hall. It didn't matter that they came to his house as officers. It didn't matter that they arrested him and brought him to the courthouse in uniform. Their argument was that the moment the beating started, they were no longer acting as law enforcement. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court rejected that claim. The court ruled that the three men were acting under what's called color of law, meaning they were still operating in their official capacity as officers, even while they were violating the Constitution and Georgia state law. However, the court overturned their convictions on the technicality and ordered a new trial for the men. The second trial began on October 29, 1945. This time, Judge Lewis W. Strum from Florida was brought in to preside. Once again, the government put on dozens of witnesses, people who testified about the sheriff's brutality and how he and his deputies took Robert's life. But this time, the jury knew their assignment. This time, the jury disregarded the evidence. Sheriff Screws, Frank Jones, and Jim Bob Kelly were found not guilty of all charges. The jury sided with Jim Crow rule, sided with injustice and brutality over dignity and fairness. No accountability, no justice, Just another black man who lost his life at the hands of a system that did not see him as deserving, not deserving of dignity in life and not deserving of justice in death. And it was because he was black. But Robert's death was not completely in vain. The decision from the Supreme Court helped to create a standard that allowed rogue officers to be prosecuted and sued for violating citizens' rights. I can do the work I do because of the Robert Hall case. Every time I represent a family whose loved one lost their life to police violence, or every time I represent someone who was falsely arrested, wrongfully convicted, or a victim of excessive force, Robert Hall's life made that possible. It gave that family, that victim, the right to sue in court, the right to seek justice. While it would have been better had Robert lived, had Sheriff Screws and the others never come to his home that night. But out of his death came a right. They tried to stop Robert's right to protest, to demand his rights. But in the end, they gave rights to the very ones they hated. Robert's legacy is alive every day in thousands of federal civil and criminal cases all across the country. Will Hall died in 1965 at the age of 73. Anya died in 2000 at the age of 85. Their son, Willie, died in 1996 at the age of 62. They each lived decades without Robert. And they each lived with a memory of what happened to him. The suffering, the pain, the cruelty, the brutality that took Robert from them. That's something that never leaves you. As for Sheriff Screws, he lived a long life. He went on to be re-elected as sheriff of Baker County and was later elected to serve in the Georgia State Senate. The people in his community rewarded him for his savagery. What Robert Hall experienced showed the depths of human depravity. It was brutality. It was injustice. It was cruelty. But at its core, it was evil and darkness. Jim Crow and racial injustice are the shadows that cover truth and light. They crush dignity, they shatter peace, and they steal life. But we will not let the darkness win. Dr. King said it best, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And so we choose to bring the light. We tell these stories because we believe in truth. We believe in justice. And what Jim Crow tried to destroy, what it tried to cast aside and forget about, we will bring light to. We will tell Robert's story. We will tell it for him and for every black person whose light was dimmed, for every arc that was cut short, for every black family that lost their peace, their pride, and their joy. We will tell their stories because we must. It's our duty, and we owe it to them. They lived a life none of us could or would ever want to live. Now, I want to hear from you. Had you ever heard of Robert Hall before watching this video, and how did it make you feel learning about him? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.